This is Basic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
It was one of the first games that was completely graphical. Because the kids using it might not be able to read the text, we did everything through gestures.
This is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Ursula Wolz was thinking about computers and education in the early days of personal computing. She worked on Apple II games for Children's Television Workshop, consulted for Atari Research on their endeavors in educational software, and taught Logo to some of the first students who learned it. This interview took place on February 12, 2016. So I understand that you've done a lot of stuff with computing and education, and you consulted for Atari Research, and you did stuff for Children's Television Workshop and Creative Computing Magazine, and I love all of those things. So I would like to hear about them.
Okay, so I graduated from MIT with a degree in linguistics and didn't really want to go to graduate school right away. And I landed in New York just as the Logo programming language was coming into its own. Mm-hmm. And I ended up as a master's student at Columbia Teachers College and as sort of an instructor because I was the only one who knew anything about Logo because I had worked in the Logo lab at MIT. And before I knew it, I was one of the professional development people. And I was just doing a coding job to make some money. And Bob Taylor at Columbia Teachers College said, I know this guy named Dave All doing this creative computing stuff, and would you like to meet him? And so I worked for Dave for a little bit. And then Dave had a consulting job with Children's Television Workshop to build their first set of computer games. And so I worked at CTW for about a year, building the original games for Sesame Place. And then I freelanced a bit and decided I really needed a computer science degree. So I went off to Columbia Engineering and got my PhD in computer science. So, and then I landed at the College of New Jersey to teach computer science for about 20 years. And so along the way, I used some of that early experience to build a game design course and to do a lot of interactive project work. And we built an interactive multimedia major. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, I said, it's time for something new. And so I've been trying to build a little educational game company over the last 4 or 5 years. And I pay the bills by being a visiting professor. And so I'm at Grinnell right now as the Noyce Visiting Professor of Computer Science.
Nice. Awesome. All right. Let's go back to the beginning with creative computing and what'd you do with Dave there?
Well, let's see. Dave hired me to take some really bad written BASIC code and clean it up so that we could so he could get published in one of his books. And then at CTW, there was a naive goal that we were going to produce about 30 games in the space of 3 or 4 months and design a kid-appropriate keyboard and design a different kind of interface, and it was going to run off of tokens, and we had one of the first Novell labs ever, networks ever. And so I was responsible for 4 or 5 games, and I like to scare my students because they ran on 8K Apple IIs.
Nice. So you said you were in charge of how many titles? You looked out for a second.
4 or 5 games. There was a version of Animal. There was a version of Towers of Hanoi. The game concepts were primarily designed by Stephen Gass, who I think is now, I should be careful. I think he's president of CTW Computing or Games or something like that. Steve and I lost touch a while back. So he would look for nonviolent versions of some of the most popular games back then. And so with Layer Cake, which was a low-res game, you had to move the cake over, and if you put a higher layer, a bigger layer on a smaller layer, it would raspberry at you. And when you got it right, there would be a candle on top, and it would sing you happy birthday.
Nice.
And that was a big deal.
Towers of Hanoi with cake.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. So, it didn't solve it for you. You had to solve it. We had a discrimination net. We had teach the animal. And so I'm pretty sure I probably built the first smut detector.
Oh.
Because when we let the grown-ups test it, they got creative. And we came into the shop one morning, and the animals were not doing very polite things. And so, we had to come up with a very early version of a dictionary in BASIC. And Raise the Flags was my favorite. That one I actually wrote in one of the first versions of Pascal. And the idea was, instead of playing hangman, you had flagpoles, and this little guy, he was armless, and he was animated, but he was armless, and he was done directly on the two-color Apple screen. And he would look in the box, and if you got it right, he would nod his head, and if you got it wrong, he would shake his head. And then when you got it right, the flag would be raised with your with the letter you had guessed. And so we got completely rid of the violence in Hangman. And the other thing was, it was one of the first games that was completely graphical. Is that because the kids using it might not be able to read the text, we did everything through gestures.
Nice.
And for the life of me, I know I did a couple of others, but I have no idea what they are anymore.
Well, what you said, 30 games in 3 to 4 months? That seems like a just crazy goal. I mean, even if they're little basic games, that's still a lot.
It was totally unrealistic. And I think we produced maybe a dozen. There were 3 primary programmers, and there was then our production lead. And we were debugging the network and debugging the keyboard and debugging the coin retrieval stuff all at the same time. And then about 4 years later, the arcade games really came into their own, and they took our beautiful games and put them away, and they put arcade games in the computer center.
So were those games published or just available just there at the computer center, or what?
They were available early on, and there's actually a website that is trying to find all of them. I stumbled onto the code. No, I think that was one of Dave Hall's games. I stumbled onto a version of Oregon Trail that I'm pretty sure I cleaned up for Dave. It was something out of creative computing, and I think that was one of my projects. But all of this is 40 years ago, so I don't remember a lot of it.
Sure.
Yeah. And then you were interested in Atari.
Yes.
The way I ended up at Atari is that Cynthia Solomon, who was also in the Logo Lab, was the director of the Cambridge Atari Research Center. And Cynthia wanted me to leave New York and come back up to Cambridge. And so she invited me out to Atari in California for a couple of weeks. And so most of my role out there was just in terms of consulting on the bigger picture of what the projects were. And I worked for Cynthia for a little bit, and then I had to make the decision about whether I wanted to accept my husband's proposal and stay in New York or go to Boston and work for Cynthia. And I decided to go to graduate school in computer science and stay in New York. So
probably the best choice.
Well, it wasn't long after that Atari lost its edge, so I think I probably made the decision in the long run. Yeah.
I mean, I can't speak to your marriage, but I do know what happened to Atari. And so what did you work on? What projects were you consulting with for Atari?
At Atari, they were trying to look at how to move into educational games. And so a lot of what I did, and it was a very short period of time, is the most of the people in the research lab in Cambridge were also out of the logo lab, and so they were really focused on environments for kids, logo-like environments, and they were starting to build the Sprite logo, and they were, we had all drunk the very, very delicious and nutritious Kool-Aid that kids should be working in microworlds, and so their emphasis on microworlds was really immersive environments, open-ended environments, and some wonderful stuff came out of that. But I was really interested in games. What can you do with games, and how can you teach kids through games? And that's a lot of what I was exploring at Columbia Teachers College as an educator. And then I realized I didn't know enough about computer science, and I went back or I went across the street to computer science. So my time at Atari was really at kind of a high level in terms of trying to think through, so how can we take the microworlds concept and push it into games? And I think we were just a little too ahead of the curve at the time. And we didn't have the tools. It wasn't until we really had serious object-oriented programming that could run on personal computers that any of that stuff can really be built, just because of the underlying complexity. So
was Atari trying to do little games like you were doing on the Apple, or were they thinking much bigger than that?
They were trying not to do Math Blaster. Okay, so
Yeah.
those kinds of games are all in extrinsically motivating. If you manage to get the number right, or get the answer right, then you can play a game. And even the games that where you shoot the right number, it's still not really engaging what Jeanette Wing calls computational thinking or quantitative thinking. Is that you want to be using whatever cognitive processes in the game. The Sims is sort of in the right direction, and I think back then we just didn't have the technology. So the technology was not robust enough. The computing that needed to do that was just too expensive. And now the interesting thing is a lot of the games that are trying to do that, or a lot of the worlds that are trying to do that, are relying on the internet. Okay, so you ship your heavy-duty computing off to some server. And that was not something we were thinking about in the 80s.
Right. Well, it probably wouldn't have been possible.
It would have been the mainframe model, and we were all opposed to that. So, yeah.
Because it was all about using the power of the computer on the desk for the first time.
Yeah, and also, the fact that it was highly individual. That you weren't time sharing, and that this very direct experience, and then we were all in love with it, with interaction. That how can you do interaction in a way that is very meaningful to people who don't have the patience to use a command line interface. So I think a lot of the work back then was trying to understand that, at the same time that we were all just trying to wrap our heads around, what are these games? What do they do for you? Is there a way to make them nonviolent? Is there a way to engage people who might not necessarily be interested in them? And I still teach a games course, and in fact, I'm teaching it here at Grinnell. And we've been spending a lot of time, on that question: is that what makes a game fun, but what also motivates you to play a game, and what is in games that's addictive? And the games that are really hot, the ones that are really popular, how much of it is addiction versus fun versus engagement?
Do you have an answer to that, or is that one of those questions that can't be answered?
We're not sure. We actually, I've been working with a statistician here at Grinnell, Shonda Kuiper, and I think we got a result a couple of days ago. I think we understand something about storytelling and its relationship to the world model underneath a game that we didn't know a few days ago. So we sent our students off to play with it and see whether that helps them model the games they're building. So I'll check back in with you in a couple of months and see whether we got anywhere.
All right. Good.
Yeah.
And so tell me about the game company that you're doing now.
Oh man, so it's called River Sound Solutions, and my initial goal was to again create highly standalone games. I'm a real privacy wonk. Things that you could play on your mobile device where you weren't necessarily having information pushed onto your device. And we came up with a couple of prototypes. And again, to pay the bills, I've been doing a lot of computing and science curriculum development. And that got me thinking about, how do you access the information that you want on the internet? And so we're still targeting down the road for game environments. But right now, what we're looking at is how do you find the information that you need to answer a particular task? So, for example, if you go to Stack Overflow, you have to figure out how to take your question and put it in terms that somebody else has asked to find the relevant information. And I've been doing very, very informal data collection on it. And because I'm an old computer science teacher, I tend to know what the right answer is in one language, and I'm usually looking for that in another one. There's an amazing amount of misinformation on Stack Overflow, and sometimes it takes a while to get through it. So we're looking at some of that and how that plays into games, and how can you navigate in a game world in a way that gets you the information you want. So what else can I tell you about the recent stuff? The real focus of the work we're trying to do, and some of it is proprietary. So I'm collaborating with a couple of companies, and most of that is still at the trade secret level because it hasn't come out yet. But what we're really interested in is how to make educational games not smell like educational games, so that you have fun in them without realizing that what you're doing is you're really learning valuable skills.
It comes down to that. Are you going to be able to create a game that was like as fun and memorable as Oregon Trail?
Yes.
Okay. Because that's the goal, isn't it? I mean, really?
Yeah. And part of it, too, is that I've got a couple of kids and they have a lot of friends. And somewhere in middle school, they were required to play Oregon Trail. And because there were 10 pages of worksheets to assess whether they'd actually done Oregon Trail, it wasn't fun anymore.
No. What was fun about Oregon Trail was sneaking off to the computer lab to play Oregon Trail when you were...
Yeah. So my 15-year-old daughter likes trivia games, and she really likes playing them across the internet. And at first I was kind of like, is this safe? And then I started watching it, and then we do it when we wait for the food to come when we're at restaurants. My family will be sitting there and we'll be playing against each other, but we're also playing with who knows who out there in the on the internet. And we learn a lot. And they're pretty impressed with the esoterica that I know that they didn't know I knew. And I'm appalled at what they know and what they don't know. So, it's the cultural divide or the age divide.
Right.
So some of it is also just thinking about the difference in the potential for games. And do you necessarily have to shoot something to play a video game? That one's still around. And then there's the whole question about girls and games. Let's see, 10 years ago or so, Microsoft was trying to jumpstart some definitive work on what kinds of games do girls like. And there was a lot of talk at the time about boys like games and girls like stories. And, boys play violent games and girls play Sims. And to some degree it's true, and to some degree it isn't. But there are other genres of games that everybody enjoys, and tapping into that is it's a challenge and it's fun. So,
nice. What haven't I asked you about the old days that I should have?
How we invented everything from scratch.
Yeah. Tell me about that.
However, once I became, once I became a PhD candidate, and then later on when I became a cranky old professor, I think the irony of it is that most of what we invented was in the theory. It was just inaccessible. And what was wonderful about the good old days is that anybody could become engaged in it very, very quickly. If you had the resources to sneak into a computer lab and program, you typically were able to find the resources. I think the thing which was sad about the good old days is I'm a case in point. I didn't start playing with computers until I went off to MIT. And I was privileged to be recruited because they were trying to up the percentage of women that were there at the time. I wouldn't have stepped into the computer lab at my high school for anything because it would have been social death. Being affiliated with that room would have, no, wouldn't have.
Right. Well, I think that's changed completely now.
Well, yes and no. We're running some programs both here at Grinnell and back in Montclair where I live, and because they're open-ended and because we're not specifically recruiting girls, we've degenerated back into 10 to 17-year-old boys. Mm. And it's hard to maintain that kind of, the kind of momentum on it. We ran courses at one of the elementary schools, and we got 24 boys doing robotics. We got 24 boys and one girl. And the girl's dad is in tech. So there's a lot of work to do yet. And I'm not convinced that the girls only things work, but we're going to give it a try. Mm. It may be something about, how you do it and what you do it. I think in some respects we had it easier back then, that the girls that were involved in it tended to be really, really good resources. We knew stuff, we knew how to do things, and we were taken seriously. And I'm not quite sure where that has changed. So, or where the social pressure is coming from.
I think I have what I need.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Ursula.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.